is James here with the Oracle Outlook for the week starting August the 31st, 2020. Thanks so much for tuning in and joining me for this week's video reading. This week I'm getting this video reading down to the wire. I am coming real late to this party. It is now late Sunday afternoon and I almost had the thought that I would just go ahead and just let this one go for a week. But it's already been a couple of weeks and I've been getting a lot of check-ins from a number of you just making sure that I'm okay. So yes, I am doing well. My mantra has been for the year 2020 is that I've been extremely busy. Other people have been, unfortunately, having to have their lives slowed down. I did not get that. My life kind of amped up, and so I am busier now than it seems like I've ever been. So over the course of the last couple of weeks, I've been involved in a Lenormand Summit with the World Divination Association, which I'll talk about at some point in the future. This week I've had a number of people book sessions, so my schedule was filled up with client sessions. So for those of you who booked a session and had your session with me over the course of this week, I want to say thank you so much. I always appreciate the opportunity to do the thing that I love to do most in this world, and that's read cards. I mean, I love it. And so I just want to thank you for allowing me that opportunity. And I hope, my intention was that I gave you the best service possible. So there was that. And in addition, and I'll talk about this at a later point in time, I have been also working on Oracle decks. There's been a few of them since the Oracle of Himm, which I posted. I made a video about that. And then the follow-up to that was the Intuitive Coaching Oracle, which I've also made a video about. Since then, there have been 3 more. 2 that I actually had printed, and they are actually physical copies that I have in my possession. And then the one that I've worked on over the course of this week, in addition to everything else, is about to go to the printer. And so this is the one that I have been led and guided to offer to the public. So I'm working on that. And so there's logistics I still have to work out behind the scenes that have nothing to do with the actual creation of the cards, right? So I'm in that space. And like with the Lenormand Summit, I will talk about that at a later point in time. Okay, so what are we going to talk about this week, right? I'm talking about other things that I'm going to be talking about at a later point in time. But what am I going to talk about today? Today, I am honoring the request of one of my viewers who asked me if I would be willing to work with tarot. And it's been a while, I will say. So, this request fell in line at the right and perfect time. I'm a big believer as a metaphysician that there are no accidents and that everything happens the way it's supposed to happen, right? And so it's just no coincidence that I acquired a new tarot deck just as this request came in. So I'm working with that new deck, and that deck is the Golden Art Nouveau Tarot. It is published by Lo Scarabeo. And so now that I've set things up, let's get to the table and see what the Golden Art Nouveau Tarot wants to share with us about the week ahead. And here we are with the cards on the table, and I'm going to take a few moments to shuffle the deck. And as I shuffle, I'm focusing on my intention for these general readings, and that is for the information, for the insight, for the guidance and advice that is going to be most helpful and beneficial to come through the cards. To assist us in moving through this upcoming week. Alright, so when that happens, just like that, that means I am done. When the cards seem to me, anyway, that they don't want to go back together, that means the shuffling is done, so I'm going to go with that. And now I'm going to cut the deck. Now I'm going to fan the cards out. And I'm picking 5 cards in the fan that are getting my attention because I am sticking with a line of 5. Okay, the 5 cards have been selected. So now I'm going to go ahead and take the remainder of the deck, and I'm going to move that to one side. Because I can clearly see I have 5 cards. I'm just going to reposition them in the order that they were selected. So this card is the last card. It's going over to the far right. All right. And I was feeling led and guided to read this line much in the way that I read Lenormand. So I'm setting that up to say that I'm going to start with the middle card. The middle card for me always represents a central issue, or what we're being asked to focus on for the week ahead. And so the card in this position is, here we have the 5 of Pentacles. So Pentacles is a suit that rules the material and the physical world. So there is things in our physical environment, in our physical 3D experience, that we're going to be focusing on. So let's talk about it a little further. When I pull this card, the first meaning that I always see is that this card talks about dealing with some kind of hardship, and it's about having your basic needs met. In some cases, this is about a concern about money and being able to pay bills, expenses, things like that. So for some people, it may be focusing on, creating change in your finances, especially if you've been having difficulties or challenges. Now, I will say this as a person who is self-employed. In that regard, the 5 of Pentacles can represent difficulty with self-employment, right? So it could be like you are in an existing business, meaning like you have been self-employed for some time, and you may be in a period of difficulty or struggle with that enterprise, that business. For me, when I used to go through the challenges in my business, I always talked about it being cyclical. And so I'm mentioning that for a reason. If you look at the image, the figures are out in a winter scenery, right? They're out in the snow, right? They're out in the cold, right? So there may be something about a particular season, quote unquote, that's metaphorical, that you are in regarding your business, right? So it just may be like you're in this state because your business may be cyclical. Like in some seasons, it's better than in others. And so you may be in that spot where it's the season. Now, it could also be because of the collective experience that we are having with COVID-19 and the coronavirus, that people who are self-employed especially are still going through a difficult period and needing assistance. And so that makes me think of the government. And so that could be local, state, or even federal government offering some kind of assistance, or that you are needing or desiring or anticipating some kind of assistance from the government, whatever the entity is in particular, but the government as a whole, right? You may be one of the people who needs financial assistance from the government to stay afloat or to survive or to have your business survive, right? So there's that to consider. So again, generally speaking, from a financial standpoint, this could just be about dealing with financial challenges and hardships, needing to create change around your finances, especially if you have more money going out than coming in, needing to take a look at that. And if you are self-employed, then you may be going through a challenging time with your self-employment venture. So now let's talk about some other possibilities, because aside from the fact that Pentacles can represent the actual physical world, it can also represent what we value. And therefore, it could represent our value system, right, which is a more intangible aspect of the suit, right? It could talk about worth and value in an intangible sense, right? Not necessarily just the monetary sense. With that in mind, this card, when it talks about relationships, can be dealing with an experience in which you are experiencing being ignored, being rejected, feeling like you're on the outside looking in. This is the card that represents the outsider for me. So feeling like you're on the outside looking in. People are freezing you out, metaphorically speaking, right? Giving you the cold shoulder, right? All those things I think of with the 5 of Pentacles. Really what's going on in all of that is about not being valued. Right? So it could be with your relationships, and the 5 is a number of change. If you're needing to change the energy in your relationships, it's about approaching it with the idea and the belief, right? Because all the 5s in tarot are connected to the Hierophant. That's the major arcana, tarot number 5. That's from the major arcana. And the Hierophant is all about our beliefs and belief systems. So with that in mind, it may be a matter of changing the belief that you may have about not mattering, not having any value, not having any importance, because there's an underlying story there about not having any sense of worth and value. And where did you adopt that? Right? So there may be some more additional work you may have to do with that story if you resonate with that. And where did you get that story? And is that story still true? Or do we need to revise it, edit it, flip the script on it? Right? You get to decide on that. Right? But it's also about changing it from the belief that you don't have any worth and value, that you do have value, that you do matter. So it may be a matter of changing the circles that you are in. And I know that sounds easier said than done, right? But it may be with one relationship in particular in which you put that into practice, and then when you see the results or the benefits of that, you may feel inclined to carry that energy over into other relationships. So with relationships, this card is about the sense of being ignored, rejected, on the outside looking in, not being valued, right? It's saying that other people are demonstrating either through their words or their deeds that your needs are not important, and they're expecting you to cater to their needs, right? So there's 2 ways of looking at the 5 of Pentacles this week. I'm going to let you decide which one resonates with you the most. You could focus on the material aspect of it, and with your finances in particular, or even your physical well-being. Sometimes this card can represent, colds, illnesses. Usually this card talks about minor illnesses, right? For some people, I'm going with the image on the card. It could be about dealing with headaches. I'm looking at the figure being wrapped up. His head is wrapped up. It could also be people dealing with issues around mobility, right? Because he's also on crutches, right? It's like dealing with some kind of quote-unquote handicap, right? What's handicapping you this week, right? And could you be wanting to put some energy into changing that dynamic, right? So that's the physical, right? And along with that, I talked about the business, and people who are self-employed, right? That kind of energy. And then you could also go with the more intangible or the more inner type work, or the inner experience, and that would be with our feelings, our emotions, and how they show up in our relationships. So that's the 5 of Pentacles. So now, as the focus, the outer cards are going to show us maybe possible factors that may be playing a role or a part in the central issue. So let's start by taking a look at the card opening the line up. On the far left, we have, as long as I've been reading cards, you cannot make this kind of stuff up. Here we have the Hierophant card, Major Arcana number 5, the card that I talked about in relationship to this card, right? So the first thing that we want to acknowledge is this card is validation and confirmation of what I said about it prior to it being revealed, right? So there is that. So there is something to be said this week about taking a look at our beliefs and belief systems, and is there something that we could change around a belief, especially if it's one that is keeping us stuck and keeping us from moving forward, right? And I would even say it may be one's belief about money, right? So some people may be encouraged to take a look at their money story this week. And so when I talk about that, it's about going back to your very first experience around money. Where were you? Who were you with? What was the experience about? And that will somehow enlighten you as to a belief that you may be carrying around to this day still about money and how you handle it and how it comes in and out of your life, right? Okay. So again, the Hierophant is all about beliefs and belief systems. another thing about the Hierophant is that this card represents social institutions. And one of those social institutions is the government, which I also talked about for those who may be needing to have their basic needs met and in the form of financial assistance, right? Now, it could also be, too, if we're going to go with the collective experience still to this day with COVID-19 and the coronavirus, it's what are our institutions doing about the situation, right? This card here, the Hierophant, he is a spiritual leader or spiritual authority, right? In some traditions, he's considered the Pope. So I'm not going to go there in the sense like this is the Pope. But if you go with the idea that the Pope is a person who talks to people in mass, right? So this could be a person who is speaking to the public about a particular topic, issue, or concern, right? It's about addressing something through the public, but this is also about speaking to the public, right? So it's making me feel like this is a matter of paying attention to the words that someone in a position of authority is offering to the public. And do we believe those words to be true? Right? There may be a disconnect between what's being said and what's being experienced. Right? And I'm going to put that with our institutions, right? Now, for some people, when I talked about the idea about being ignored, being rejected, being frozen out or out in the cold, this card is all about socialization, right? So it's about being in society. So again, it could be that there are some people who are wanting to be around people more. And I would even say, going back to this may have to do with people who are maybe traditional in mindset and could be like churchgoers, because the Hierophant can represent the church. So there may be something about, people who are religious in particular, and expressing their beliefs. And maybe if they are outside of the church, meaning they haven't been in church for some time, because the figures here are outside of a church. This is a church window here in the background. So outside of the church, right? So they may be expressing some concern or their beliefs about the situation and how it is affecting and impacting their religious and spiritual life, and maybe their religious traditions, things of that nature. I'm not a traditional religious person, but that is the impression I'm getting from these two cards, right? Now, it could also be that there may be someone who's dealing with their spirituality and maybe considering coming out of more traditional, or mainstream religious circles. Right? And it may be that you are experiencing, as you are doing that, you are experiencing being, for lack of a better way of saying it, excommunicated, right? So people are freezing you out that you used to know from your religious circles, right? Because you may be adopting a more spiritual approach to that aspect of your life because your belief systems have changed. Remember, the two cards are talking about beliefs and belief systems. So your beliefs and your belief systems may have changed, or maybe in the process of changing, due to what's going on in your material world. So you may be seeing things in your environment, in your world, that's getting you to question what it is that you thought to be true. And here's the question is, do you still believe that to be true or not? That's what I feel. I feel for some people there may be a challenge around what you used to believe, because there may be some changes with that. Right? So I'm taking a step back to say, what else do I want to say about the Hierophant? Yes. So this is what I also want to say. This may be also for people who are teachers, because the Hierophant is about teaching and public education. So there may be, again, with this card being about illnesses and outside of the system, so to speak, there may be something about education. So this could be about people who are returning to school in the education system and having to do your work differently because of changes that have been made in regards to the coronavirus, right? So that's what I'm seeing with the Hierophant at the beginning of the line. It's making me feel, in a nutshell, this is a week where we're getting to take a look at our beliefs and our belief systems and asking ourselves, is what we thought to be true still true? Do we believe that to still be true? Or are we willing to change that belief? Middle card. Yeah, okay. Clearly, for some people, I'm going to start with what I said about religion and spirituality. The Eight of Cups is a card that talks about making a departure, right? The person has the cups all stacked up and is walking away from them, right? So in a sense, this is about a departure. It's about walking away from something that is no longer healthy or no longer fulfilling, right? So for some people, in a spiritual sense, this may be about seeking wisdom and enlightenment, and you have to depart from the environment that you are in, whether that's literal or metaphorical, in order to do that. Now, in relationships, if you are dealing with a relationship, or you are in a relationship in which you are feeling that you are being ignored, that your needs are not being met or addressed or even valued, you're feeling the sense that you don't matter. When the Eight of Cups comes up, it talks about walking away from a relationship that may be toxic in nature. And I'm hearing the Britney Spears song, excuse me, in my head, toxic, as I mentioned that. So for some people, it may be about walking away from a situation which you now realize to be unhealthy, and you even are aware that it's toxic. Right? And the other thing I already said, but I will repeat, is that somebody may be on a spiritual journey, and it may be about leaving what it is that you believe to be true, especially if it's more mainstream, more traditional. You're walking away from that. Okay, so that is the Eight of Cups. That's a departure card, a journey card, right? So that could be in the literal sense or metaphorical. So now let's take a look at what's on the other side of the Five of Pentacles this week. And here we have the Five of Cups. Okay, so very interesting. First thing that I want to point out is we have 3 5 cards. We have the Hierophant, we have the Five of Pentacles, and now we have the Five of Cups. So the 5 repeats 3 times this week. So there's something about change and activity, because those are the associations I have for the number 5, right? Also, too, it's about beliefs and belief systems, because the Hierophant is in the line and it governs all the 5 cards, right? So now, the other thing that I want to note is that we have 2 cards from the Suit of Cups flanking the middle card. So we have Cups in ruling majority this week. So this is about our feelings, our emotions, our relationships. With that in mind, this card is about disappointment, right? So we are experiencing a challenge in our physical world, right? On a physical level, but also on an emotional level, right? So this is about, going through a process of disappointment, right? And usually for me, when I pull this card, the idea of disappointment is because we've had some kind of expectation, and then the reality of the situation set in, and there's a disconnect, right? The reality did not match up or line up with the expectation, and that's how we get disappointed, right? And it may involve some kind of loss, because on the card there are 3 cups that are spilled, but this card carries with it a positive message, because it says that not all is lost, right? The person here is focusing on the cups that are spilled, but behind him or her, there are 2 cups that are still standing upright, which suggests that there's still something in the situation. You haven't lost everything. It's a matter of changing your focus, changing your perspective, right? And that's all this figure has to do here, is he or she would have to turn around to actually look at the cups that are still standing, right? And I even want to say this, as I mentioned the word still standing, I'm being told to say, like, if you are going through a hard time, a difficult time, we don't want to do what I call in spiritual circles bypass. We don't want to bypass how you feel, right? But at the same point in time, these two cards are saying, yes, you may have gone through a difficult time or undergoing a difficult time, but you are still standing, right? You haven't lost everything, right? But you may be focusing on what you've lost and that you can't get back and not addressing what you still have, right? Now, for some people, if we are talking about your beliefs and your belief systems changing, then this card would suggest that as part of that process, you may be feeling a sense of regret or remorse for what you used to believe and believe in, right? And so you could give yourself permission to feel that way for a little while. But after some time, you may want to ask yourself, what do you get out of indulging in those feelings of regret and remorse, right? Or what would you be willing to do that's more constructive as a way to channel that energy of regret and remorse, right? There's a couple of ways of looking at that. You know, you could indulge, because I'm hearing an old song. It's by a singer named Leslie Gore, yes, and it's quite old, but it's called It's My Party. And so the gist of the party is, gist of the song is, it's my party and I'll cry if I want to, right? So you may want to give yourself permission to cry because it is your party, right? But at some point you don't want it to become a pity party, right? So you could feel what you feel and then ask yourself, what would I be willing to do to change this emotional energy? Or maybe to turn it into something more positive, right? Something that works for you rather than works against you, right? Now, in relationships, okay, because I talked a lot about relationships this week, right? So in relationships, when this card comes up, right, because we talked about toxic and unhealthy relationships, relationships in which we're being ignored, not being valued, that our needs are not as important as those around us, right? And if that's the case, then this card is about taking a look at our expectations when it comes to other people, right? So sometimes this card can turn up to suggest that we have placed the bar too high with certain people because they cannot fulfill the expectations that we have of them. And so this might be the week where you become more aware of that, right? And it's not about lowering the bar. It's about becoming more aware that the person is either one or two things, either not able to fulfill the expectations that you have for that person. And it may be a matter of learning, right? Giving the person the chance to learn a new skill set, right? To equip themselves with the tools to better fulfill the needs that you have, right? Especially if you feel like your needs are not being met and you're being ignored, right? So there's that. The other possibility is that the person is not willing. There's a difference between not being able and not being willing, because the person from the not being willing camp could very well fulfill your expectations but just doesn't want to do it for whatever reason. And you need to be aware of that. You either need to see it or hear it or even believe it, right? The late Dr. Maya Angelou said that when people show you who they are, believe them. So this might be the week where you start believing who the people around you are. Like you really are seeing their character through their demonstration. I mean, you're really seeing it, right? Okay. So again, Five of Cups could represent disappointment and how do we work through that if we're experiencing some kind of loss. Giving yourself permission to grieve and mourn the loss, right? But at some point, you have to give yourself permission to move on as well. And then taking a look at managing our expectations, whether they are self-imposed, meaning the expectations that we have for ourselves, or the expectations that we are placing on other people this week. Okay, so now let's take a look at the final card. Wrapping things up this week, we have the High Priestess. There is a pattern going on here. So what we have here is we have the middle card flanked by two cups, right? And then the outer cards are each from the major arcana. So two cards at the end of the reading talking about important issues, important lessons, things of that nature. Now what I find interesting about the pair is that the Hierophant is a card that talks about spirituality and the church. But also, too, the High Priestess is also about spirituality because the figure, the High Priestess, is in the Temple of Solomon. She sits between the pillars of Boaz, which is the B, and Jachin, which is the J, which is, if you are a traditional Christian, then you know that that is a reference to the Temple of Solomon. So this talks about wisdom, right? So if that, she's sitting in a place of wisdom, right? So this is about gaining wisdom this week through our experiences, right? How are you becoming wiser through the experiences that you have to walk out, especially the challenging ones, right? Now, I will say this. If we are experiencing, this idea I talked about, being frozen out, being rejected, ignored, devalued, excommunicated, all those words, right? If we're experiencing that, the High Priestess at the end is all about the lesson being independence, right? And I'm hearing, as I'm saying the word independence, the Fleetwood Mac song, You Can Go Your Own Way. So for some people, this may be a matter of going your own way, right? And here's the thing. I talked about this for the people who may be embarking on a spiritual journey, yeah? And feeling a need to walk away from something traditional or mainstream. This card is the mainstream, right? The norms, the traditions, all those kinds of things that go with maybe the more mainstream or conservative approach, right? And then here on the other end, on the other side of the line, the other spectrum, we have the High Priestess talks about the metaphysical, the esoteric, all those kinds of things, right? So there may be somebody who's departing from this camp and moving towards this camp, right? And needing to deal with all the people who may be not in alignment with this camp, right? And they may be espousing all their beliefs about being in this camp and what this camp entails and involves, right? And so you have to kind of navigate through those relationships. Do you want to hold on to those relationships even though people believe differently than you? And you believe differently from them, right? And if so, how can you navigate those waters, right? So the High Priestess, again, is all about independence in that regard. If we're talking about more intimate relationships, when she shows up, in still keeping with the independence part, she can also represent disappointment in love, because now we have disappointment being repeated twice here with the Five of Cups and now the High Priestess, right? So there is something to be said about somebody going through not having your expectations realized and needing to process that. And I'm saying that because of the moon, the crescent moon on the card represents your intuition, but not just your intuition. It also represents your feelings and your emotions, which is what fosters your intuitive growth and development, right? It's about learning to pay attention to your feelings, honor your feelings, and as I'm saying the word honor your feelings, that could be what it's about for you. This could be a matter of you learning to honor your feelings, especially if your feelings have been discounted by other people in the past, right? Right, and so if you are experiencing being discounted, right, how can you give yourself the worth and value that you are not receiving from the external world, right? It may be that you start with that. You give it to yourself, right? And so the question was, would you be willing? She represents receptivity, and willingness is a part of receptivity. Would you be willing, right? And again, just like the Hierophant, she also represents teaching, right? She's holding the Torah, which is the Jewish book. And so this could represent study, education. But it could also represent getting something wrapped up, because it's a scroll, right? Only the scroll is partially open, partially revealed, right? So it could be like, this week, it may be a matter of you making a choice or decision as to what you're going to choose to share with other people, especially if they believe differently from you, right? This may be a week where you might have to consider the idea of like keeping your own counsel, right? Or, sharing information on a need-to-know basis, right? And it may be because you've discovered that people don't believe the way you believe. Right? And then the other thing I will say along with the Torah is that that's also known as the Jewish book of law. So there may be something about wanting to do the right thing. Or, there may be a question about believing in the right thing, or what's the right thing to believe in, or what's true. It may be a matter of you believing in what's right for you, right? There are many different belief systems in terms of spirituality and religion. So it could just be a matter of you finding one that is right and perfect for you this week. And then the last thing I will say about the High Priestess as I wrap this up, for some people it may be about discovering the aspects of yourself that you lost along the way in relationships. And the High Priestess at the end is asking you, would you be willing to rediscover those aspects of yourself? And so on that note, I will go ahead and wrap up this week's Oracle Outlook. I'm James Himm Mitchell, and as I wrap up, I'd like to thank you for sharing space here with me for this week's video reading, and I'm looking forward to sharing the same space with you again in a future reading together. So until then, I am hoping that you are going to be having the best of days, and I'm going to be hoping that you have the best of weeks. Take care.